I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to our fire risk management panel session today. My name is Ian Taylor. I'm the category manager for fire safety and compliance and procurement for housing. The purpose of today is to look at an increasing problem for the housing sector, managing those actions following a fire risk assessment. We've got a good cross section of PfH members in attendance today from all over the UK. And our panel will be discussing the management of post-fire risk assessment actions, prioritising risk versus budget, and the expectations of the fire authority around those actions. Our panel is made up of three different viewpoints. We have a landlord, a contractor, and a fire risk assessor and consultant. Today we have St Ledger Homes with us, represented by Laura Dugan, Health, Safety and Compliance Manager, and Carol Raybould, who is the Fire Safety Compliance Officer at St Ledger. Rob Shenton joins us, who is Head of Business Development at Fieldway Group. And finally, we have Simon Brett with us, who is Managing Director at Fire Compliance Management Services. So before we get into the discussion, I just want to mention some general housekeeping, as we often have on these Zoom calls. So the session is being recorded. Please feel free to ask any questions as we go via the chat function. Just type them in, and we'll pick those up towards the end. We will follow up after the session with a recording, so you can watch back for anyone who's not with us today, and share that within your organisations. We will be launching a poll shortly through Zoom to ask a question, which we'll follow up on again at the end of the session. And there will also be a survey once the session has ended for attendees to complete. So we'll move on to our first discussion point for today, which we've termed cost versus compliance. So you've done your fire risk assessments, and you've got a list of actions that's as long as your arm. How do you prioritise those with a view of cost against compliance? What's going to cost the most money, and what's most important to do? Laura, if I may, I'll pass that over to you in the first instance, as ultimately this is your problem.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just a quick intro to who St Ledger Homes are. You mentioned about we're a landlord. Technically, we're not a landlord. We're a managing agent, because St Ledger Homes are in Almo. We're one of the Almos still left in the country for Doncaster Council. So that throws in, when we're looking at how we're managing our risks, another aspect of that, because we've got another stakeholder involved in potentially decision making, and also the governance and around how we're making those decisions. So that's something to consider in all that. In terms of us as a business, we're probably about a medium-sized organisation. Our stock's about 20,000 properties at the moment. And in terms of communal areas or communal blocks where we've got that responsibility and duty to do our fire risk assessments, we're currently at 551. So that's the size of our problem, if you like. Within there, different levels of risks of those buildings, like we all will have. The ones we tend to focus a lot of our attention on, we've got 9 high-rise blocks, 3 specialised housing schemes which bring their own issues and concerns, so they're a sort of separate entity. And then the bulk of our fire risk assessment programme is made up of low-rise blocks. So the background to where we are today is that approximately 3 years ago, as a business, we took the decision to do all our fire risk assessments again. We had in-date fire risk assessments, but clearly, like most housing organisations at that time, we were critically looking at the information we held. So we took the decision to do them all again. And we're working with a third-party fire risk assessor to do those fire risk assessments for us. We did that over quite a short period of time, so 500-ish fire risk assessments over probably about a year to 18 months. What that's left us with is a legacy of fire risk assessment actions, which in hindsight, and I think at the time we did challenge ourselves with this, we were going to leave ourselves with a problem of potentially how we were going to deal with some of those actions that were coming out there and the bulk of those. So we're now in the situation where I think it's fair to say we've picked off all the easy wins. That was our first priority. We're going through making sure we could, where we could, managing those actions, picking off the easy wins. Now we're left with the bulk of those are actions that we need to work with a contracting partner to deliver, and we need to work out how we're going to do that. We started off the question and we were talking about this, about cost versus compliance. So our priority, initially has always been based on the level of risk of a building, that life risk. So going back to what I said there, we've always focused on making sure that prioritising the actions within our higher risk blocks, and then looking at what makes other blocks higher risk to try and juggle that programme of works. We have got a fixed budget, like everybody's got a fixed budget. That budget was fixed historically for the next 5 to 10 years. So to change that now, to sort of go back to our biggest stakeholder, the council, who give us that capital money, to sort of say, well, we need to change that now, that's the conversation that we've got to have to explain why we might potentially need some more resource to do that. And the other thing we've been doing is trying to reduce a lot of focus on the number of overdues, and perhaps we might all be in that situation. You see those number of overdues going up and up and up, and again, you're just trying to pick off easy wins or smaller gains where you can. And we're doing a piece of work currently where we're looking at specifically overdue actions, not in what I would call a very logical way at the moment, in that they weren't done in a building by building approach. It was very much just okay, we've got a number of actions that are overdue, let's engage with somebody, get them to do some surveying for us, and then we can work out what work we need to do from that. Is that sustainable long term? Probably not. That's not the way to approach something like this. And the other aspect, and the other way we've been trying to deal with our actions, is by utilising our direct labour workforce. So we have quite a big direct labour workforce at St Ledger, which is good. So we've been using we've got some specially skilled joiners working with us, so we can actually get them out to actions where we need them to be, dealing with things sort of almost on a reactive basis for us to go out and deal with those. But as I said, that's where we are now. That's how we've been managing things. But for us, that's not a long-term solution and a fix to the problem of where we are now. So what we're actually on with now is looking at a 10-year potentially investment program to deal with the actions on a building by building approach. So we're actually saying, right, okay, so this is our stock. We know the level of risk of our buildings. We've got 3 levels of risk. We've chunked them all up. How can we put that into a sensible program of works? Because things we need to consider within that are contractor availability and resource. We need to look to engage with contractors now, but we know that everyone else is looking to engage with contractors as well, potentially to deliver big projects of work. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, can we do more to upskill our DLO to actually get them where they need to be to deliver some of this work for us? Because in an ideal world, we'd love to keep all that work as much as we could in-house, because that's got its benefits, obviously, as a business for doing that. And I mentioned there about the sort of the reactive to the planned aspects of things, because these are legacy actions that we're dealing with right now, but we're still doing our fire risk assessments on a cyclical programme, and we're still getting actions that are coming out, new actions potentially that are coming out through those. So we need to deal with those, and it's the balance, isn't it, of we've got a new action in that we can probably deal with straight away, but we've got an old action we can't deal with. So it's how we get that message to people that we're dealing with those before we deal with some of the legacy ones. So that's, in a nutshell, kind of where we are at the moment at St Ledger. And what else we're trying to do as well is work with our fire risk assessors to avoid, where we can, unnecessary actions, because I think when we look back at some of the actions that have come through, we're not arguing that we don't need to do some of the remedial works in buildings. We do. What we mean there is things like a lot of the management related actions that were sort of coming through. So we're working with them to see where we can avoid getting those repeated ones coming through, because they take your focus away from your bigger pieces of work sometimes. So we're looking at where we can, having standard responses to answers, attendance by Carl, particularly at fire risk assessments, so we can actually give the right information at the right time to the fire risk assessors to avoid that as we move forward. Carl, I've wandered off there. Have I caught everything that you think we're doing or we need to say?
Yeah, I think the only thing for me, Laura, is you did touch on regarding competence throughout our organisation, aren't we? And that's something we are very mindful and keen to explore even further, into where we are planning on upskilling our workforce to try and deal more and utilise our own work staff for that. I'm not saying there isn't a place for external contractors, because Absolutely. There isn't. It's just an additional resource that we, even more so now using the cost versus benefit, is that we need to utilise more, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Laura. I think it might be a prudent time to sort of launch that poll, having highlighted some of the issues you're facing there. So we'll just put that out now. There we go. If everybody just wants to quickly answer that, and we'll sort of see what the results come back and sort of feedback on some of those points from Laura. Okay. So the question was, how confident are you with prioritising actions from the fire risk assessment? So sort of come back roughly half and half. 52% of the people attending have said that they are somewhat confident, and 48% of the people are very confident in prioritising those actions. Okay. Rob, obviously you're working with St Ledger on some of those points as a contractor. What are your thoughts around some of those challenges that Laura's raised?
Well, I guess the first thing is it's sort of quite reassuring and refreshing, really, that they are taking a sort of building by building approach to it, really, with the actions. I mean, we have worked on and there is a cost benefit to that, I feel, with the clients as well. And what I mean by that is we have worked on FRA contracts in the past where it's been very action driven in terms of the, we will get a list of FRA actions, which I appreciate that the client, whether it's a housing association or local authority, have to action and close off, but it might not be sort of coordinated and planned in a very efficient way. In terms of, you might just have the operatives, for example, going around and just doing it action by action, but it might be at one site one week and then the next week they're going to do another action because it wasn't in a specific order. There's sort of more disruption to residents and things like that with multiple visits and things like that. So I think with St Ledger, it has been refreshing that it's actually grouping the actions into the site, which obviously, as I say, it sort of minimises that disruption to the residents, and it cuts down the costs as well. We're not working on sort of stringent SORs, so we can offer sort of economies of scale based on prelim savings from being on site a little bit longer and things like that, rather than sort of bouncing around from site to site doing quite small actions. So that's the main benefit from our side, from a contractor side, which is then ultimately passed on to the client, really, as well.
No, thank you for that, Rob. Simon, as well, there was a sort of comment in there around the fire risk assessor and perhaps what they're determining is an action and whether or not it should be an action. I'd be quite interested to bring yourself in there as the person who's done any number of these assessments over the years.
Okay, so from my point of view, consistency is key. So when you're getting risk assessors go out on a larger estate, you may have 6, 7 assessors all writing actions down in different ways, all meaning the same thing but in different ways. That can get confusing. Also prioritizing actions. So it's not just about consistency of what actions and how they write the remedial works that are needed, but also consistency in timescales, because timescales need to be achievable. They need to be sustainable. And the worst thing to have is a load of actions that say 1 month on them, when you know damn well that's not going to happen. It's just not achievable. So that brings me back to a risk assessor will put a perceived risk rating in, and they will put a perceived time scale in, and that needs to be consistent. However, that's only a recommendation. That's only a recommendation. Once that hazard has been identified and the risk rating has been put in, the risk assessment then goes to the client. The client is the risk owner. So a responsible person has to delegate that responsibility down, because the responsible person is not going to do all that. So the responsible person looks at a load of actions, sees 6 months on them, 3 months on them, 1 month on them. Everybody starts panicking, because you've got a lot of actions that you know are not going to be achievable to complete and close out. Therefore, you're going over KPI. The KPI is set in the risk assessment. However, it should be the responsible person that plans these works and puts their own action plan together and actually bolts this together. So I heard Laura say you bolt jobs together. You've started doing that now. That's great. You need to look at prioritization. You need to look at where is the money best spent. What is the don't forget, risk assessments is all about life risk. There's only 3 things in life risk in a fire risk assessment you need to be concerned about generally, and that is, can we stop a fire in the first place? Can everybody be warned of a fire at an early stage? And can everybody turn their back on a fire and walk away if necessary? Those are the 3 main things a risk assessment looks at. So the risk assessment, the timescales in there are only recommendations in an ideal world. So what you need to do then is take those actions and re-rate those, if you like, in your own action plan. Not rate them, not re-rate them, but prioritize them in a way that you can manage them sustainably. Ian, does that answer the sort of the question? Is there anything else you'd like me to add to that?
Could I just ask a question? Sorry, Simon.
Sure.
Well, just talking about prioritising then, it's really just keen to get a consultant's viewpoint of it. I'm obviously speaking about how St. Ledger are working on a building by building basis, and that's great from a contractor's perspective and a client perspective in terms of cost and everything else that I mentioned earlier. But is there like a sort of matrix that you would work off, for example? So if you've got a raft of actions, and okay, is it just a case of taking that? How would you prioritize which building to do first? Do you know what I mean? I get which actions you do first, but if you go, okay, that building's got the most high priority actions, so would that be do that one first, or is it not as simple as that? Or
well, so a risk assessment, if it's co-compliant risk assessment, it would actually compliant with the PAS. You would actually have an overall building risk rating on there. Now, the risk assessor will actually take the hazards that they've identified, and if there's a high risk hazard in that element, or even if there was a due diligence, something very high that they've had to mention, automatically that building would go to a high risk rating because it's got high priorities in it. So there's a couple of things to think about when we would be looking at managing hazards and risks for clients. And that is, first of all, you've got to get your foundation right. You've got to look at the global documentation. You've got to look at your fire safety risk, your fire safety plan, if you like. So you've got to have a policy, you've got to have procedures, you've got to have consistency with the way you're going to deal with remedial actions in a property. You don't want 6 different people doing remedial actions and all advising you different ways. You need to have a consistent approach to the remedial actions as well. So we first of all look at the global actions that may be there, and they're quite easy to fix, to be fair, because most of them are global actions, would be things like management actions. You can do them on a desk. Yeah. The other actions are things they're finding on site. So there'll be things like, fire alarm systems that are not working, which should be working. Now, we know in social housing, stay put policies, generally the fire alarm systems are in the flats themselves, which are not covered under the RO, they're stay put policies. But where you've got communal areas in buildings where you have fire alarms which are required, which are not working, of course, that needs to take us high priority, because that's one of the key things that I was talking about. Can you prevent a fire? Can you be warned of a fire at an early stage? And can you turn your back on a fire and walk away? So for me, prioritization would be, first of all, anything to do with fire alarms or early warning would certainly be a high priority. Anything where people can't escape from a fire would be a high priority. Things like compartmentation. We all know about compartmentation. The hazard was the same hazard yesterday than what it was today. The risk hasn't actually elevated at all. It's the same one. Those sorts of compartmentation issues, they need to be pulled together as a project. Now, we won't touch on what the fire service would expect yet, I guess, because it's a bit early. But what I would say is that the risk owner, the responsible person, they need to actually look at that and say, well, you know, which ones are the highest priority? High rise are going to be the highest priority because it takes longer for people to get out of those buildings than what it does for a low rise single story or 2-story building with a small single staircase with 4 flats in it, for instance. So you would look at elevating the risk, or that, you know, the risk rating or prioritization, I should say, not the risk rating, but the prioritization to do works. You look at how easy would it be for people to leave that building if it was poor fire stopping and everybody had to get out because the fire brigade came and the fire started getting holed and the stay put policy was failing. How hard would it be for those people to get out? It would be a lot harder than a single story building, for instance, Rob. So I think there's the whole element of things, but it's all revolved around those 3 principles of fire risk assessment ultimately. So housekeeping issues, quite cheap to sort out, and they can be done quite quickly. Would you prioritize? Yes, you would. You would definitely have that as a high priority. Why would you have that? Because it's easy to fix, and secondly, you're stopping a fire from starting in the first place. You're actually removing the fuel that could create a fire. So by taking away that, you've broken the chain of fire in its first instance. So always prevention better than cure, and that's how we would work, and that's how I would advise. So some things like fire doors, even a worst case scenario, a fire door without an intermittent strip is going to hold fire back long enough for people to be reasonably safe. So you've got to think about, if you've got a fire door without a self-closer or a flat, that would be a high priority. If it's a damaged intermittent strip, then that wouldn't be such a high priority. But remember, and like you said, Rob, I think that the key here is when you're working on a door, you might as well complete the door. You might as well complete all the remedials on one door, for instance. So I get the idea of doing building by building. I think that's great. But you really need to be looking more at the global things and how you can bring that global hazards together in the best, most effective way, really.
Okay, if I could just sort of chip in there a couple of things in terms of that. You're right. The starting point is, I think it's just about understanding your buildings, knowing what you've got and what you're dealing with. And when we started this program of looking of doing our fire assessments again, the first point was, well, what are we dealing with? What is our stock? You know, do we understand it well enough? And we didn't at that time, so we got to understand it, and we knew exactly what we were dealing with. And now we understand the risk of our buildings. They're all trunked up. We know what risk level they are, and if needs be, we'll change that risk level dependent on anything that changes within those buildings that might affect sort of the, like you said, the management of them. And in terms of the actions, you're quite right. There'll be global management actions that are really easy to deal with from a desk, and we can deal with those and close those off. That's not a problem. We prioritize the housekeeping ones as soon as the fire risk assessments are sort of handed over to us. they go straight off to our housing management colleagues, and they'll be dealt with in a really proactive, sensible way. And the good thing about the system we use for managing our actions is it's auditable. We have to prove we've done the action with a piece of evidence. So that's all uploaded. It's checked by a couple of people in the team, then it's approved, and we close it off. And then it's a case of quite regularly we will sit down and go through all the other actions, and actually, as you've just said there, pick out the ones that do need to be dealt with quicker than waiting for any other sort of approach that we're going to deal with these. Anything that needs to be picked up as just a repair, basically. So that'll get funneled off through to the repairs team for them to pick up, like as they would if it was reported through by a tenant ringing through with an issue. Sorry.
So one of the things, Laura, there that I would say that when you're looking at, you've got a system in place. Do you have is there more than one people making those decisions, or have you got? Yeah, there is. So the way I would deal with that is I would actually have a matrix of how to deal with that, so everybody deals with it in exactly the same way.
Right. From a consistency. And
secondly, if we go back one step further about dealing with actions, what has been, I heard you say about legacy actions. Now, you do a baseline risk assessment that will probably pick up all the remedials for maybe passive and active, definitely passive fire safety, because that doesn't change so quickly. Active does slightly. Housekeeping changes on a daily basis. However, what you've got to be careful of, if you have your risk assessments done yearly, 2 yearly, and you use different contractors, different people, you can actually end up with a load of duplicate actions. So the one thing, and all written slightly different, so they're hard to determine if they are duplicates or if it's something different. So generally speaking, a fire risk assessment, the latest fire risk assessment you have, should be the only actions you need to deal with. Yeah. A lot of people keep actions after actions after actions with every review of a risk assessment, and you end up with 20,000 actions, when actually if you cleanse that, and I do a lot of this, and you end up with 6,000 actions, of which all the rest were just duplicates of previous risk assessments. So I think one of the things to remember is the risk assessment that you do, the latest risk assessment, should identify all the actions in that property. Yeah. If it's not, then it's either not suitable and sufficient because it's missed things, or they've been closed out. So ultimately, I always advise our sort of people that we work with that the latest risk assessment is the one. Yeah. If it's not on there, it shouldn't be in the system anymore. So I don't know if that helps, but that is key. When you think about it, a risk assessment needs to be compliant. It needs to have picked up all the hazards. And if it hasn't, there's only one reason for that. It's either not suitable and sufficient, or they've been closed out and they don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. No, thanks, Simon. Just one minor housekeeping point is one or two people raised their hands. I'm not sure if that's accidental or if they've got something they want to say, but just a reminder, if you do, just type the question in the chat feature and I'll pick up at the end. I don't think we can do two-way conversations on this type of call. I guess we'll sort of maybe start to move on to the sort of second point we wanted to discuss today, which was around planned versus reactive, which we've already sort of touched on. As you know, these things do tend to lean into one another. But Rob, as a contractor, what do you think is the most important consideration there in terms of planned versus reactive?
Yeah, well, I think Laura touched on it there, really, just in terms how she mentioned that St Ledger managed the FRA actions as soon as the FRA comes in to the office. And it's sort of understanding who or which contractor, or whether it's internal resource, is responsible for each type of action, if that makes sense. You know, that there could be some of the quick wins that can be done in-house, but then I think it's also quite important to split it out into other sectors, even if it's just sort of active in terms of any problems with, like Simon mentioned, with the fire alarm system or the emergency lighting, for example. that really should then be passed on to the service and maintenance provider, or whoever provides that service. Then you potentially have doors and then other sort of compartmentation work as well. Whereas again, I'm just speaking from experience here, when we have done a very sort of action-based or action-led FRA contract, where it's literally been for Fieldway Group to complete every single FRA action, which is fine for us as an organisation, because we have that sort of resource to do both active and passive. There was a lot of the active stuff in particular that we would get into that had actually been done between the FRA being done and us being sent the action. It'd been done by their service provider anyway, you know, whether a replacement or a replacement light or something like that. So again, from a client point of view, that sort of filters through to the contractor, I think it's just planning who is responsible for those actions and how you want to sort of procure the contract, really. And for me, the answer would be in more than one direction, rather than just an FRA contract going to all one place. It's splitting it up, and again, that could even make it easier to prioritize in some ways as well.
Yeah, so that touches on, Rob, which I was saying about risk owners. Yeah, so risk owners, so you have the responsible person that is ultimately responsible for the whole of fire safety. They'll delegate people to manage risks. Doesn't matter what risk it is. So, and then there'll be fire alarm situations, which a risk owner will be maybe yourself, Rob. There'll be, so it's down to have a consistent way of getting those actions out to the risk owner, as it were. And it's also quite good if you do risk owners for housekeeping. I'm sure you do, Law, already, because people tend to, once they become a risk owner for housekeeping issues in a certain building, for instance, they get a bit passionate about it, and that's exactly what you want, because these risk owners should also be reporting stuff back, which, you know, things they find, because the risk assessment is really only good for the day it was developed, a bit like a car MOT, and after that you're relying on the eyes and ears of other people, including yourself, Rob, that'll pick up stuff along the way, being, if you like, the risk owners. Yeah.
And I think as well, I mean, we're about to start a compartmentation program for a housing association client as well. And again, if you look at that and go a little bit back to sort of cost versus compliance, if you actually look at the number of actions that we're doing, it's just one action per site, because the original action on the FRA would have been to complete a compartmentation survey that we've done, and then we're about to do the compartmentation work. Whereas on one hand, we're only doing one action from several actions that have been identified on a particular site, but from a cost point of view, it's going to be the highest cost. But from a compliance point of view, it'd arguably be one of the most important, because the compartmentation work is obviously going to drive the fire strategy of being able to stay put and things like that as well. So yeah, it's just an interesting sort of spin off, really, in terms of balance off between that cost and compliance again, really.
I get that, Rob, and also I think the way the risk assessors, whoever they may be, actually put the actions down is key as well. So you get some risk assessors that will have 200 actions in their risk assessment for one building, and it will be, for instance, they'll do a sample door survey if it's a type 1, 10% sample of the door, and they'll put the hinges are not fire rated. That's one action. Intermittent strip is on the door is missing. That's another action. They'll have another action saying there's a damaged letterbox. That's 3 actions on this door. Okay. And then on top of that, they'll say, based on this sample, you need to do a fire door survey to determine the rest. So straight away, and if they do that on 10% of doors, and you've got 100 doors, that's 10 doors. Straight away, you've got 30 actions plus the 10 doors saying you need a survey on each one. If you're not careful, you can have 30, 40 actions, when actually, if there's a fire door on a flat and you pick up actions, why don't you put that all in one action as one? And that would help you as a contractor to do that piece of work. You've got the door closer's wrong, the strips are wrong, and it's all in one piece. Your actions don't look half as bad when the chief exec or whoever gets these actions at the end user of the actions, don't look half as bad if you bring them into manageable chunks. And that starts with the risk assessor.
Yeah.
Some risk assessors will say, oh, we do that so it's easy to manage. Actually, it's not easier to manage. You know, if you've got one door with some issues and then you put that in as one action, that's all to do with that door. That can be done a lot easier. And also, if you need to do a fire door survey of the building, which we all know we'll have to anyway, but this is more of an action needs to be done straight away because they found real deficiencies. Then why not put that in one action for the whole risk assessment rather than putting it in for every door you find? Because all of a sudden you start getting duplicated actions as well. So it does start with the risk assessment and consistency and the consistent approach and how these people put actions down on paper.
Yeah. So, guys, we've had a question relating to this from a delegate. So, they've stated that the review part is vital, but surely it would be better to be done by the risk owner on an ongoing basis. What do we think about that?
So what you have an action that's been so you've had an action, a hazard identified, and you've had a risk owner placed against that. Yeah, placed against that hazard. The best person to tell you if it's been done correctly or not is the actual risk assessor, because they're the one that actually put the action down in the first place. So a risk owner, if they go back and have a look to see if it's been done, first of all, you need to have competence there to be able to say that it's been done correctly. So there's two elements there. Yes, you could do it, but I think the best person to check whether a remedial work has been done correctly is the person that created the action in the first place, because they know what they wanted. Yeah. Now, there's only so much in a risk assessment they put in. They give you a very brief oversight of what needs to be done. Yeah. So a competent person should be able to read that and say, we know what needs to be done based on this. If they can't read that action and know what needs to be done, there's two things that can happen. Either the risk assessor is not putting it down correctly, or the person that's reading it maybe not the right person to be reading it. So, but I think the first person to close out an action is the person that actually created it in the first place. That's what I believe.
And in terms of an ongoing review of those actions, would you say that is the responsibility of the risk owner to keep that as a live process rather than something that is fixed in time?
The responsible person has a duty of care to make sure that the risk assessment is a live document. It should never be a dead document. It should be reviewed constantly. So it should be reviewed if the situation changes, yeah, or on a regular basis, as it says in the RRO, and that will be based on different rated buildings. So, for instance, if you had a building that had a lot of high risks in it, a lot of hazards that were high risk, I would suggest that you would do that at least 12 monthly or even before, because you need to keep an eye on those actions and make sure they're being closed out. If it's a low risk building, no actions found or very limited actions found, a couple of mediums, maybe a couple of lows, then you would extend the period of time when you're reviewing. So there is nothing in the RRO that says you need to do it at set dates. Yeah, it's risk-based approach. And the only way you can do that really is be driven by the overall building risk, which is put into the risk assessment, and that's driven by the actions. So generally speaking, that's how it works. Everything else is done, and it'll be set out in the companies or the organization's baseline of what they decide and how they decide to do it. But when people say, is there something in writing to say you need to do it X amount of time? No, it's a guidance, and the guidance, if you have that element in your risk assessment, it's only guidance to say that we recommend that this is done 12 monthly. The risk assessor should be looking at that based on their opinion, based on the overall risk rating of that building. That's how they would look at it.
Okay. Another question I would want to bring up, perhaps for Laura in the first instance, and one of the outcomes of the Hackett report was that there was a greater requirement for resident involvement and engagement in the fire risk assessment process. How are you guys managing that?
Okay.
Oh.
No, sorry, Laura. Sorry.
Okay, right. So in the actual fire risk assessment, I mean, I don't think there's any expectation that our residents would physically get involved in a fire risk assessment, but we tell them that they're happening. Obviously, we've got housing management teams who engage with them regularly. In our higher risk buildings, we have specific forums for each of the blocks. So they know when the fire risk assessments are happening. We've got a building safety team who will engage and liaise with the residents in those blocks to tell them about works that might be happening or findings from the fire risk assessments. What we're still on a journey to is working out how to probably effectively share the risk assessments with residents, because with the best will, I don't think just giving a copy of a fire risk assessment to residents the way to go. I think everyone would probably agree with that, and also probably giving them a list of the actions from a fire risk assessment isn't the way to share that information either. I don't think. I'm not sure that would have the impact it would need to have.
As risk assessors, we've got our own policy that says basically we have one-way communications with residents. Yeah. So that means we will actually, and that is under the Hackett report, we are getting them involved in the risk assessment as such, because we ask things like, do you know the emergency plan for the building? Yeah. Are you aware that you're not supposed to put stuff out in these corridors?
Yeah.
Those sort of things, advice sort of things, we can communicate, and we ask them questions like, you know, little things like, do you realize why the door's got a lock on the front door to reduce the risk of arson? Little things like that. But anything that we find would go back to the responsible person first, and then they manage it, because we all know that in this climate, if you start going to residents and saying you've got this wrong, you've got that wrong, before you know it, you've got a whole block of people that want to leave the building, etc. So we leave that to the responsible person, if you like, or the organisation. But we do, and I do believe that having a little bit of input into a risk assessment, like for instance, just doing those basic things that I said, not reporting back problems, but giving them positive feedback and positive things they can do to reduce fire. And that's only really housekeeping generally, and emergency plans. That gives them a feeling of being involved. And I think that's important in the synergy of a risk assessment. But you're right, Laura, you've got to be careful how you manage. You can't be going back and saying your building's got cladding all over it and it's dangerous, because if you do that, we all know what happens.
Yeah, it's just how you communicate, isn't it, and that messaging that you give. And and you know, I mean, I've seen lots of organizations do things in lots of different ways, and I'm not sure that the right fit doesn't fit for everybody, does it? So admittedly, we're still trying to work out how we do that in a really sensible, pragmatic way.
I mean, it is a fire risk assessment is a public document. So
obviously, you could request it. You could pop a freedom of information request in, and we'll submit everything out to people.
You've got that, and it's surprising actually how many people don't actually act on that. Not to do with social housing, but I've actually asked for a risk assessment in a couple of hotels that I've been to, which have been a bit dodgy, and they've blatantly refused to give it to me. So I don't go down the road too far, but knowing what I know I would be actually entitled to it if I wanted it. It's surprising how many people don't act on that facility.
Okay, we're about coming to the sort of the end of the time that we gave. We said 12:45. There is just I guess it's just time for any wrapping up from anyone. Anyone's got any final comments? Perhaps Laura, I'll come back to you.
I think from our point of view, and certainly when we met with yourselves and spoke with Rob as well, it can feel a bit isolated sometimes as a provider, thinking that you're the only person that's dealing with any of these issues. And I think there's some reassurance that on, different varying degrees of complexity, everyone's probably dealing or facing similar challenges and issues in the housing sector, and we need to remember that. And I think collectively as a sector, it's something we're all trying to find an end goal for as well. So it's good to know that, in some respects we're not alone and we are on the right track.
There is just one more question coming, which I think we'll pause quickly whilst we're here. Does anyone else make use of a primary authority partnership with the Fire Authority to challenge FRAs and ensure consistency across all the local authorities? Is that something anyone's ever seen?
It's not applicable to us because we're just within one authority, but
Okay.
yeah, so I can't comment particularly on that.
I can comment to say that there are numerous organisations that do use primary authorities. I'm not going to comment whether it's successful or not, but what I would say is that there are several. But just wrapping up, Ian, on from my point of view, I know that people are interested in what do the Fire Authority want to see when they come out on site, etc. There's risk assessments with actions on it. Well, what they don't expect everything to be done straight away. They expect the fire risk assessment to be suitable and sufficient. What they do expect is to see a plan from the responsible person, not a fire. You've got the fire risk assessment plan, which is one plan, and if you can achieve that, that's great. You can use that, but at least they would want to see a plan for all your actions, for all your risk assessments across your portfolio, and see that it's being managed correctly and see progression in what you're doing. They do not expect, and under the RO, when it first came out, it was not there to trip people up. It was not there to cost people fortunes and make people bankrupt. It was there to improve fire safety. So any fire inspecting officer that comes on site would look to see that it's being dealt with and managed in a systematic way. So don't think that you've got one outstanding action on a risk assessment, it's not going to be suitable and sufficient. From a fire brigade's point of view, they would say, well, how are you dealing with this? Yeah, if they come to an action and it's a high risk action and it's blatantly something that, the fire alarm system's not working in all the communal areas of where you've got shared community areas, communal areas like, maybe a village hall or something, whatever it may be, of course they're going to look at that and say, why haven't you done anything about this? But as for fire doors, fire walls, fire lines, linings, etc., as long as you've got a plan in place and they can see you consistently putting that together and you've got a budget for it and it's all being dealt with, they don't expect to see it all done on day one. That's important, I think.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Simon. Really useful insight there, I think. Rob, is there anything you want to add before we wrap this up?
Not really, and just it's been really interesting, obviously, to discuss with different stakeholders with different perspectives. Really, I guess even just going back to that cost versus compliance. I think compliance is always the main driver, obviously, but it's realizing that there isn't a sort of bottomless pit of money to do every action all at once, sort of thing, really. So I guess it is for clients and contractors to work and consultants to work closely together to prioritize those, really, and what's best for all stakeholders and the residents in particular, really.
No, okay. Thanks for that, Rob. Thanks for your time today, everyone. I think it has been a really useful session, and as I said, the session itself will be made available elsewhere. It might be worth just revisiting that poll from the start, maybe just asking the question again following the session, see if anyone's answers changed. Okay, so it does look like two-thirds of the people attending have said that their confidence has improved. Some it hasn't, and some have said that it has somewhat. So hopefully, it does sound like the session has been a useful one for those in attendance. And as I say, it will be made available for sharing around organisations for people who couldn't attend. So again, I will thank each and every one of you, Laura, Carl from St Ledger, for your time. Really appreciate it. Simon, your insight from the fire risk assessment background and the fire authority, really useful. And Rob, obviously, as a contractor on the ground. Again, thanks for your input there, everyone. For the attendees, thank you for joining us today. If you want anything further, please do reach out through the usual channels. And there will be a poll at the end of the session. If you could, sorry, not a poll, a survey at the end of the session about the session itself. So we'll leave it there, guys. And thank you everybody for your time today. I really appreciate it and found it a useful session.
Okay.
Thank you.